into Wilmington. I-40 was not there. The first thing that you saw as you came in was the battleship that was there at Eagles Island in Wilmington. And I remember seeing that and was fascinated with it. And that fascination continued. And one of the reasons why I chose the history field years ago was because of this, and also Fort Fisher State Historic Site, which is now one of the sites that I supervise in the East Region. So it's amazing how our love of history, or love of anything in general, can come back and make a powerful impact on our lives. Now tonight, what we're going to talk about is not necessarily a history of the Battleship North Carolina, because that would take many, many hours. But we are going to talk about some of the key aspects of its history, but also, when possible, I'll try and use the words of the crew members, the crew that served on board the Battleship North Carolina from 1941 to 1947 when she was decommissioned. So you'll see some quotes from a lot of the crew members, photos when I have them of them, and also tell you a little bit more about some of these crew members as I came to know them when I worked on board the ship, during the crew reunions when we would do oral histories with these gentlemen. And the only best way to learn the history is to hear it from the people that made it. So with that, we'll get started. Now, the North Carolina was the first of its class. So originally, it was supposed to be more, but 2 ships were in the North Carolina class. The USS North Carolina, BB-55, which is the U.S. Navy's term for battleship, and BB-56, which was USS Washington, which was built south in Philadelphia, not too far after when North Carolina was built. Now, the North Carolina class was a result of the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. So this limited battleships to 35,000 tons and limited to 16-inch guns. So originally, the North Carolina was supposed to have 14-inch guns. But nobody else was abiding by that part of the treaty, so the United States didn't either. And so when North Carolina was finally built, she was built with 16-inch guns. Now, the North Carolina was the first of the modern battleships, the first of the fast battleships. Now, fast meaning for a battleship at that time, 28 knots, 7 knots faster than the Colorado class, which was a previous class of battleship. So the fast battleships were built fast for one reason, and that reason was to keep up with the aircraft carriers. So the aircraft carriers were very fast, and so the old lumbering battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor could not keep up with the new aircraft carriers. The North Carolina was the first one that would, and in exchange would make naval history using the battleships as anti-aircraft platforms and shore bombardment platforms rather than ship-to-ship platforms. Now, the length of the battleship was 728.8 feet, a beam of 108 feet. For those of you that like trivia, the reason why ships were limited to 108 feet, does anybody know? To get through the Panama Canal, that's right. So 108 feet was about maximum that they could squeeze through the Panama Canal. A draft of 35 feet, 6 inches, and displaced 36,000 long-ton standard. Propulsion was 4 sets of General Electric geared turbines, which would generate the speed needed to achieve 28 knots. And also, it had a 16-inch armored hull and also a conning tower. So the conning tower was 16 inches, and the belt plate around the hull of the ship was also 16 inches. As we'll see later, the torpedo that damaged the North Carolina hit just forward of that armor belt. So we'll see what happened with that in just a few moments. What you see at the top left are the construction diagrams of the North Carolina. And also the photo at the bottom here that was taken sometime in 1942 and showing the different diagrams for the ship. These were all U.S. Navy publications during the war. Now, the main reason for a battleship, of course, are its guns, correct? So the 16-inch guns the main and secondary battery guns of the North Carolina consisted of 16-inch guns and then 5-inch guns. So they had 9 16-inch guns, 45 caliber, a little bit different than the Iowa class that came out about a little bit later. Mark 6. So the 16-inch guns, how they operated is you had many layers below the turret. So everybody that has seen the North Carolina sees the 16-inch gun turrets. Now, if you go below that, you'll see different levels. The next level would be the projectile handling room, and then finally, all the way down below would be the powder handling room. You never want to keep them together. That would be bad. And also the powder handling at the bottom had many layers of fire suppression system. So in case anything did come close to hitting the powder magazines, that they would flood the forward magazines. Does anybody know how the USS Arizona actually blew up the way it did at Pearl Harbor in 1941? It was the forward handling room, the forward powder room and projectile room that went up with that bomb. So the North Carolina was built with a little bit more armor than the Arizona on the decks to keep that from happening, from a bomb piercing all the way to the bottom of the ship. Now, the projectiles would be loaded up. They had two types of projectiles that they could use, armor piercing or high explosive. Now, armor piercing, of course, was to take on enemy ships. High explosive is what they used mostly during the war, and that was for shore bombardments. And so you had two different types. They would be loaded up through hoists, and then the powder, 6 bags of powder would be hoisted up as well for each shot. So, and then it would be loaded actually inside the turret and then fired from down below. So it was not fired from inside the turret. The guns were fired deep below the ship in main battery plot. And if you're on board the ship and you go through main battery plot, you'll see brass handled, looks like pistol grips. Those are the actual triggers for the 16-inch guns. So they would be fired from way down below in the ship using a very complicated computer system that would measure out distance, speed, height, elevation, and all those things put into a modern computer, the very most modern computer that they had at that time in the 1940s. It takes about the size of half this stage now, but today we have more than that in our cell phones. But it could calculate all that and fire the guns from control, main battery plot. Now with all Navy systems, it has a secondary firing system. So if things went really bad, you could fire it from inside the turret. But if you were firing from inside the turret in battle, things were pretty bad. So usually they were fired from down below. The 5-inch guns were 5-inch 38 caliber Mark 12 guns. The U.S. Navy used these for years, all the way up into the 1980s. If any of you were in Vietnam, in the Navy at that time, you saw a lot of the 5-inch 38 caliber guns on board our ships. They were in mounts. These are called mounts, not turrets, and they were twin mounts. So there were 10 of them. 5 mounts on the port side, 5 mounts on the starboard side, together in a row. So these were the main anti-aircraft guns for the North Carolina. And so these were, the crew members hated to hear these things go off, and they hated serving in them because they had a very high, loud crack whenever they went off. The 16-inch guns, they said, would just thump you in the chest. The 5-inch guns would pierce your eardrums. So they were really very effective weapons, though. And on the side over there, you'll see the 16-inch guns firing in battery. Now, the anti-aircraft batteries of the North Carolina is what everybody here that has children or grandchildren has seen them working on the 40-millimeter guns or the 20-millimeter guns on board the ship. Now, when the North Carolina was commissioned, she had a different armament for anti-aircraft guns than you see on there now. So the guns that were on board the ship in 1941, when the ship was commissioned, were the ones you see to your left. The 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, as you see here at the top left, these were the forerunners before the 40 millimeters that are on there now. The crew hated these guns. They were very unreliable, and I talked to a gun captain who was on board during the war when he served on 1.1-inch guns, and he said he always carried a mallet with him, a wooden mallet. I said, why do you carry a wooden mallet? He said, because the thing jammed after every 3 shots, and I had to hit it with the mallet. So they hated the guns. These were later replaced in 1942, give or take, with the 40-millimeter anti-aircraft guns, which you see over there on the top right. Now, the Bofors there were 60 of them on board the ship. These were very highly effective weapons. So they were intermediate anti-aircraft guns. So they were fired from actually a director. So if you're on board the ship and you're looking at a 40-millimeter, look up. And you'll see what looks like little hand cranks like this with a little thing that you look through. That's how the 40-millimeter guns were fired. They had a little trigger on them. So wherever he sighted that is where the guns would actually fire. And it would allow for lead and for distance and everything else. The people that were actually on the mount itself were just loaders. They were there to just feed the tubes with the 40-millimeter shells. Now, if things went bad and the director went out, They could fire them using the hand cranks, as you see. But those hand cranks were not like they are now. They were hydraulic, and they would go very quickly if you used them that way. The North Carolina started with the 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns here on the bottom left. These were the first anti-aircraft guns installed on board the ship. As you can see, not a lot of protection, pretty much out in the open. These are similar to what you would have seen on board the ships at Pearl Harbor. These were later replaced with the 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns, the Oerlikons. There are 48 of them, 20 millimeter 70 caliber guns. And the crew that you see over there was the first African-American crew to serve on a 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on board the Battleship North Carolina. And they were credited with taking down a kamikaze off Okinawa in April of 1945. Mr. Saunders is the fourth from the right in that picture. And he was the first African-American to actually serve on board 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns on board the ship during the war. African-Americans were usually used as stewards or culinary assistants or cooks. And so during this time, you see them more starting to man the anti-aircraft guns during the war years. Now, one of the crew members said that they could tell how the battle was going, an anti-aircraft battle was going, just by listening to the sounds of the guns. So when an aircraft was coming, you heard the 5-inch guns open up. And they said, okay, well, we're starting to get a little nervous. And then you could hear them firing a lot faster. He said, but when the 20 millimeters opened up, you knew they were close because they had to get very close for the 20 millimeters to hit a target. So when they heard the 20s going off, they started to get really nervous. And so all of the crew members that I talked to talked about that. Very interesting. Now, the keel was laid down at the New York Naval Shipyard. For those that have been in naval service, it's always going to be known as the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But its real name is the New York Naval Shipyard, on 27 October 1937. Her hull was completed and launched on 13 June 1940. The sponsor for the launching was Isabel Hoy, who was the daughter of the governor of North Carolina at that time. After launching, a launching is a big ceremony in the United States Navy where you see the champagne hit across the bow. It's bad luck if it doesn't break. And that continue, and that is a fact. That's not a superstition. It makes for a bad, unlucky ship. But after launching, then the ship is taken to a nearby pier where it's fitted out. So fitted out means that they put the superstructure on, the guns on, and make it ready to be commissioned. Usually takes a couple of years for that to happen. Due with war clouds looming in Europe, war going in Europe and potential war in the Pacific, schedules on the North Carolina were increased. And so less than about a year later, the ship was commissioned. Now, this is a quote from Smitty Smits, who was a water tender first class on board the North Carolina. Just to show a little bit of the confusion that was going on with the launching crew. So when a ship is commissioned, they're given a pre-commissioning crew, which is basically a skeleton crew that helps get the ship ready to be commissioned. Now, Smitty Smits was a water tender, so he worked in the engine room. But he was told that he was going to be an electrician, so they sent him to electrical division. And as he said, the ship was just being built, so I was told to go sweep up a compartment with a huge switchboard in it. I was just sweeping along, minding my own business, and saw an electrical armor cable running under the switchboard. I picked it up and lifted it so I could sweep under there, and I hit 2 huge switches with the cable. There was a huge white flash and a big flash of smoke, and I was knocked cold, and tossed across the room. They found me and brought me around with no ill effects except for a burned hand. I had shorted out half the Navy Yard and the ship too. I asked to be put back in the fire room and was in number 3 fire room the next morning. I've hated electricity ever since. And as you can see, this is a picture of the North Carolina during the fitting out period in New York before she was commissioned. One thing that I'll show you in this picture, which is the best way to see it, is there's a walkway around the center of the superstructure that you'll see in later pictures. You can see it here. It's not there. It's just flush. So what this is called Stryker's Bridge. An XO during the war years wanted that built onto the ships for a better lookout for anti-aircraft purposes. And so they built it. So that's the one difference between her and her sister, the Washington. And that's how you could tell them, was North Carolina had Stryker's Bridge, Washington looked like this. That was flush. Commissioning. Now, this was a big deal for the North Carolina, because the North Carolina was the first battleship to be commissioned in about 19 years. And so it was, and as I said, it was one of the first of the modern battleships. And on April 9th, 1941, the world's fightingest ship was commissioned at 11:30 in the morning in the New York Navy Yard. And this received immediate media attention, tremendous media attention, because this was the symbol of the United States coming out of the Depression years and heading into the war years. So this was the ship that was designed to be the biggest and best in the United States Navy. A quote was, "The 35,000-ton battleship North Carolina, solid, gleaming symbol of America's wakening from a sleep holiday of 18 years. 29 minutes of ceremony and dazzling sunshine, formally placed in service the $70 million battleship it had taken nearly 4 years to build. The commissioning was 4 months ahead of schedule." As bugles blared and white-capped officers and blue jackets saluted, a pennant was run slowly up the flagstaff to show that the ship was in commission. Millions listened over the radio as the mightiest battleship afloat was put into service. This is from the Young Catholic Messenger in New York on April 25th, 1941. As you can see on the top right, the first commanding officer was Captain Olaf Hustvedt. He was a career man in the Navy, very well respected, what they call one of the gun bosses. So these were the guys that commanded battleships at the time. He was one of the old breed, very well respected throughout the fleet. And von Falkenberg, who was the captain of the Arizona, was a good friend of Olaf Hustvedt. And when I was on board the ship, there was actually letters from Captain Hustvedt to von Falkenberg not long before Pearl Harbor. And of course, Captain von Falkenberg was killed on the bridge of the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. On the bottom right is the commissioning photo. As you can see at this time, the ship would be placed into commission, orders read, and then the ship would be brought to life in the Navy terms. And when the pennant flag goes up, the ship is now in commission. Now, the crew of the North Carolina in 1941 was 108 officers and 1,772 enlisted men. During the war years, though, with more anti-aircraft guns being brought on board and more machinery being put in place, radars being put in place, the number of the crew increased. So during the war years, it was 144 officers and 2,195 enlisted men. As you could tell, as walking around the North Carolina, you see berthing areas or racks or bunks everywhere, correct? For those that have been on board. They would have used every bit of space that they could to give people bunks on board the ship because it was designed for a crew a little bit smaller than it was. Now, the commissioning crew, talking to a boatswain's mate at the time, Paul Weiser, who you'll see a quote from later, Paul said that there was a lot of New Yorkers and a lot of guys from New Jersey in the crew when it was commissioned. He's from Bayonne, New Jersey. And so he would often say that it was almost like walking the streets of New Jersey and seeing all the gangs in all the different divisions. He said it was just like being on the streets. So in the crew, your division was your home. Now, everybody's home was the ship, but your division was your family. So, and you didn't associate very much with people outside of your division. And if somebody from outside of your division came into your berthing area or came into your workspace, they were going to hear about it. All right, so you just didn't intermix that way. So it was very clannish on board the ship when it came to the divisions. You had, they were numbered for the guns, and also you had a CR division, which was radio men, CS division, which were the cooks and bakers. So you had a bunch of different types of divisions on board the ship. Now, after a ship is commissioned, they go on what's called a shakedown cruise. And the North Carolina was constantly going in and out of New York on its shakedown cruise. And the purpose of a shakedown cruise is to make sure everything works properly, to make sure that there's no kinks in the system, the machinery, the guns, everything like that before it goes potentially off to war. Now, the North Carolina was going in and out of New York so many times, and with all the media attention surrounding it, other ships started nicknaming her the Showboat, which was after a popular play at the time, the Showboat. And the name stuck. It was not meant to be a flattering nickname. There was kind of resentment among the other ships, and especially the Washington, which often called her the Showboat. but the name stuck, and the crew took great pride in it. Now, during the shakedown, they tested all weapons, electrical plants, engines, and fittings, and for the first time ever, fired a complete broadside of all weapons to the port. So basically what that means is all the 16-inch guns trained to the left of the ship, the port side, and they all fired at once. The 16-inch guns, the 5-inch guns, all fired at the same time. This had never been done before. This was the largest salvo in naval history during that time. They said the ship moved in the water a good bit. People were hanging on because it moved that fast. But they said everything pretty much held together. And they noticed that the ventilation system smelled a lot cleaner because it blew out all the ductwork. So it was, other than that, nothing much happened after with the firing of all the guns. Now, as we get into, on December 7th, 1941, the USS North Carolina was in the New York Navy Yard. Most of the crew had liberty. They were taking in a football game, or they were out and about of the town when word came over the radio that Pearl Harbor was attacked. And all sailors and all military men were to report to their bases and report to their ships. This was a lot of the crew members that I talked about, they said they didn't really know where Pearl Harbor was at the time. Some of the older hands did, but the newer ones, they didn't really know a lot about Pearl Harbor. But they knew one thing: they were finally in war. And so North Carolina during this time continued her shakedown cruise up and down the eastern seaboard, putting into Hampton Roads to pick up more crew members, including a radioman that was very key in the living history, the crew of the North Carolina, Chuck Patey from Charlotte, and went all the way down into the Caribbean as well. So finally, they got their orders, and the orders were head to the Pacific. As everybody knows, at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific fleet was basically destroyed. Luckily for the United States, the carriers were out at sea, so the carriers were not hit, but all of the battleship fleet was now at the bottom of Pearl Harbor or beached. So the North Carolina was going in to hold the line until the American fleet could come and rebound. After a voyage, North Carolina arrived at Pearl Harbor on July 11th, 1942. As the crew lined the deck in dress whites, they saw the devastation of the attack and knew they were finally in the war. In the top picture and the bottom pictures, you can see the devastation that they would have met their eyes as they came in. As the ship pulled in, the crews from around the harbor let out cheer upon cheer, and as help had finally come from the States. One crew member told me I remember hearing the cheering, and he said, "What are they cheering us for? We haven't done anything yet." But Ben Blee, who later served on board North Carolina, was on board the Pensacola at Pearl Harbor, and he remembered one sailor remarking to him, "Ain't you glad she's on our side?" when she came pulling into Pearl. Now, the North Carolina was immediately put into a task force with the USS Enterprise, and in August of 1942, they were sent to, people that know their history, August of 1942, where were the Marines landing in the South Pacific? Guadalcanal. So this would be for the coverings for the Battle of Guadalcanal. They were with Task Force 16 with the USS Enterprise, and at this time, North Carolina experienced their first taste of combat in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th and 25th, 1942. Now, as I said before, as the battleship started to progress, as the fast battleships had their duty, was basically to provide anti-aircraft fire for the carriers. That was their main job when they were escorting the carriers. 7 dive bombers targeted the ship and was credited with downing 5 enemy aircraft. During this time, a radio came to the North Carolina, a radio message from another ship asking if it was a fire because of the amount of anti-aircraft fire the ship was putting out. It looked like the ship was on fire. North Carolina's anti-aircraft barrage helped save the carrier Enterprise, and thereby establishing the primary role of the fast battleship as protector of the aircraft carriers. On the top right, you'll see a picture that was taken at the Battle of Eastern Solomons, and it was a bomb that exploded on board the Enterprise. The person that took this, the sailor that took this photograph, was killed by the explosion that you see here. But that was one of the explosions that hit. And also you see the strafing runs from Japanese planes on the bottom there on the USS Enterprise at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Now, at this time, we also have the first fatality on board the ship. George E. Conlon, was the first of the crew to be killed in action in a strafing run on the Fantail and was buried at sea. And this is from Mike Marco from his diary, talking about George Conlon, and immediately right before, during the battle. He said, "The time is now 1740, and I'm now looking at a wounded man to see if I know him. Boy, that hole is through his life jacket and through him and out his life jacket. It's horrible. Now giving him morphine. They've rigged up a bottle of blood plasma and are giving him a transfusion. The man is very white from the lack of blood. It puts the fear of God into a man to see things like this. Good-looking boy just married to a beautiful gal just before we left Frisco. Stand by for another air attack at 1555. False alarm. The man has just now died." And what you see, this is a picture of George Conlon, and then on the right is his burial at sea, not long after the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. He was strafed on the stern of the ship, manning the 20-millimeter aircraft guns on the starboard side, and a Japanese plane came in and strafed the deck and hit. He was taken inside the superstructure, which is now right on the tour route. It's a closed door, so you can't go in there. It's a machine shop, but that's where he was brought in, where he later died. Now, having gone through the first baptism of fire at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the North Carolina was once again called upon to taking care of the aircraft carriers. So on September 15th, 1942, while in escort with the USS Wasp, the Japanese submarine I-19 quickly fired 6 large torpedoes at the U.S. carrier, the Wasp. These torpedoes struck the target in causing much damage to the task force. 3 other torpedoes raced on ahead several miles and after missing the Wasp. And 1 torpedo slammed into the U.S. destroyer O'Brien and basically tore the bow off it. It would break up several weeks later to do after severe damage. Another torpedo, now these weren't necessarily fired at the battleship, blasted North Carolina on her port side just forward of the thick armor belt that protected her from such a torpedo. The enormous blast shook the ship, and the crew spent hours fighting the oil, and the water went skyward. Tons more were quickly flooded into the other spaces to right the ship. It resulted in a 32 by 18-foot hole in the ship's side, causing the ship to list to the port side. The crew quickly counter-flooded on the back side. So if you don't know, ships have voids that go along the outside of the ship's hull. So, and these can be flooded or are taken out to maintain their keel, the even of keel. So when the ship started listing to port, they flooded the starboard side to make it secure. Now, the problem with this is that there were some men that were trapped forward. 5 men were killed when the torpedo exploded on the port side. One of these men, Leonard Pone, a gunner's mate, was actually in the shower just forward of where the torpedo blast hit. Probably outside of being killed instantly, but he was locked into the forward spaces by the damage control teams to keep the ship afloat. The others, William Skelton and Oscar Stone and Albert Geary, were actually working on the voids right above where the torpedo hit. And one sailor remember walking by them, and they were hunkered down in the voids trying to fix something inside them. And when the torpedo hit, so they were probably killed instantly. So as you can see on the left here, this is the hole that the torpedo made in the side of the USS North Carolina. The ship, as I said, counterflooded. They sealed off the forward edge, and then it made its way back to Pearl Harbor, maintaining speed. So the damage control teams on board the North Carolina were outstanding for something like this to happen. This could sink a normal ship, but the damage control teams worked quickly and effectively and stopped the flooding. Now, life on board the ship was usually the same every day. General quarters, where they manned the battle station, they usually did it right in the morning, right at first light, and right at night, right before the sun set. Those were the best times for Japanese aircraft to attack the ship. So they always manned general quarters first thing in the morning and in the evening. They had food, 4 hours on, 4 hours off for watches. They wrote letters, catching up on sleep a lot. But it was really, really hot below decks. If anybody has toured the USS North Carolina in Wilmington in the summertime, it's warm. Now do that in the South Pacific with thousands of men on board the ship. It is downright hot. So most of the men went against orders, and they slept. They brought their mattresses up onto the main deck and slept on the main deck. So they, various things that they usually did to try and maintain their health. So being on a large modern ship, the crew could enjoy the geedunk, which for the people that are not in the Navy, a geedunk is like a snack bar or a snack, not a snack machine then, but basically it was like a ship's store that sold candy, it sold soft drinks, Cokes, everything else you can imagine. And ice cream. They had their own ice cream machine on board the ship, and also pretty good food. So the galleys on board the North Carolina, there were mess halls on the mess decks on the port and starboard side, and they kept food going pretty much around the clock. Now, liberty for the crew was either at Pearl Harbor when they went back to Pearl, or Mogmog when they were in the Pacific. A little tiny island that the men said was better than nothing, but it was basically an island where they would give you 2 cans of beer. So then the cans of beer were stored down in the brig, in the bottom part of the ship. So the average room temperature of those beers was probably about 110 degrees. And, but the men drank them, and they said, one of them said that he swears it smelled of formaldehyde. And he said, but he still drank it. But room temperature beers on an island in the South Pacific. So that was their much needed break in the stress of war. So, and you can see men on Mogmog on the top right photo there. And then you can see berthing areas on the bottom right. That's racks stacked 3 or 4 high. They could be stacked up to 5 high. And so you got to know your shipmates very well. On the left is what's called a smoker. A smoker is a sports activity that they had on the ship. Usually boxing was very popular. And so on the fantail, they would set up a boxing ring, and the men would box. So anything to keep their spirits up and recreation on board the ship. Now, in April of 1944, North Carolina made a little bit of history. The American carrier planes were assaulting Truk in the South Pacific, and the North Carolina was protecting the carriers, as usual. The battleship's Kingfishers, the OS-2U Kingfisher float planes, which one is on board the ship now, these were used for observation, for firing of the guns. So the battleship's Kingfishers were assigned rescue duty and took to the air on the morning of April 30th, 1944 to look for downed American flyers. Lieutenant John Burns, who's pictured on the top left, his aircraft was overloaded with 7 rescued pilots and crew members. So he landed, picked up one, and then landed, and then another one picked up. Soon he was too heavy, he couldn't take off. And also his left float was damaged in one of the landings in the sea. So he kept taxiing and taxiing until he came across the USS Tang. He rescued 7 pilots and crewmen and was stranded for 5 hours before the Tang picked them up. As a submarine rendezvoused to pick up the rescued pilots, the Tang sunk it with gunfire. So Lieutenant Burns was awarded the Navy Cross. He was tragically killed the following year during a training exercise in Virginia on February 24th, 1945. But this made history, and you see on the top right, that's the crew of the Tang, and with the downed flyers. Now, on December 18th, 1944, the North Carolina and Task Force 38 were caught in a typhoon while steaming through the Philippine Sea. This is the famous typhoon that you've probably heard about in books during World War II in the Pacific. Winds rapidly built up to over 100 knots. That's a lot of wind. The ocean swells created high crests and deep troughs. 3 destroyers in the task force took on water and capsized during the typhoon. On the occasion, the battleship rolled 30 degrees, so that is like this. So anything much more than about 30 or 40 degrees, and the ship's going to capsize. So as you can imagine, it would have been terrifying. It would have been more terrifying being on a destroyer, which was a third of the size of the battleship North Carolina in those kind of conditions. Bob Palomares, who was a gunner's mate on board the ship, said he just remembered being washed down the deck toward the #1 turret and hitting all those obstacles under all this water. And when I came to a stop, I was under the spray shield of the 16-inch gun. And that's what stopped him, was that steel spray shield on the 16-inch guns. Bob and some of his mates were sent forward to try and work on some of the lifelines and some of the gear that went adrift while the waves were crashing over the ship. They thought the officer was crazy, but of course they did it. But Bob woke up against that 16-inch gun, and it washed him all the way up across. And this is a picture of the beginning of the Typhoon on the top left with the North Carolina. And you can imagine the force of those seas that on that ship of that size with the waves hitting over the top of it. Now, on April 6, 1945, the ship, along with 3 large aircraft carriers, 2 light carriers, 3 battleships, 4 light cruisers, and 12 destroyers, were fighting off the coast of Okinawa. Now, during the day, an estimated 182 Japanese kamikazes in 22 groups attacked the Allied ships. So as people that don't know, the kamikazes were Japanese ships that were designed to fly into the American ships, killing the pilot himself, but also damaging the ships. The kamikazes were very hard to hit because if you damaged them at all, they didn't shear off. They kept going straight into the ship. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, an Allied ship fired at a low-flying kamikaze, and it struck the Battleship North Carolina by accident. A 5-inch 38 caliber projectile hit the base of the port side 5-inch battery director. This is Sky 2. Now, that's what fires the 5-inch guns. Remember I said that everything was automated? This was what fired the port side 5-inch guns, and so that was the director. 44 men were wounded and 3 were killed. Edward Bren, Carl Crom, John Watson were killed during this time, and 44 were wounded. Now, with the coming of the war year, the end of the war, Paul Weiser wrote, "We got word over the public address system that the Japanese surrendered. The war is over, and you could have heard us out in New York City screaming out there in the middle of the Pacific." This is a picture of Paul in his new car that he got in Hawaii. Actually, it's not his. He said he just took a picture next to the car so to show his girl that he got a new car. But because the first thing I asked him, I said, "Boy, that was a nice car. How did you get that?" And he said, "No, it was just parked there. He just put his hand on it to get the picture." So Paul was a good friend of mine who married his high school sweetheart, Jean, during the war years. And they wrote letters to each other every day. Before Paul went to war, Jean gave him a pen and pencil set and said, "Use it." And boy, did he. Paul donated to the battleship all of the letters that he kept, that Jean kept of Paul's letters to her. They were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. And so they continued their correspondence throughout the war years and were married right toward the end of the war. Paul passed away just several years ago, but loved the ship, and was just an all-around great guy. Now, the end of the war. Following the Japanese surrender on August 15th, 1945, North Carolina contributed men for the initial occupation force and entered Sagami Bay on August 27th with the rest of the fleet. So with the initial occupation force, the men were giving rifles, and they had to put on leggings, which some of them had not worn since boot camp, and they had to go ashore, and so the old adage is never give a sailor a gun. So, but things went okay, but they were kind of out of their element. On September 5th, she steamed into Tokyo Bay and was assigned to Task Force 11 for a return to the U.S. as part of the Operation Magic Carpet. So she was finally going home after all those years during the war. During the war years, the ship suffered 10 crew dead and 67 wounded in action and received 15 battle stars, the most of any battleship during the war years. For her service during the war. Only the Enterprise earned more battle stars and the carrier. And these are the 15 battle stars, ranging from the landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi in August of 1942, all the way to the bombardment and airstrikes of the Japanese home islands on July 10th to August 15th, 1945. Now, at the end of the war, the United States Navy had literally thousands and thousands and thousands of ships. So what to do with all of them? Well, North Carolina was spared from the mothball fleet immediately, She was arrived in Boston on October 17, 1945, and then underwent an overhaul in Brooklyn. Thereafter, she conducted training operations on the East Coast, including training cruises for the midshipmen of the United States Naval Academy. These are called MIDI cruises, and the United States Naval Academy still does these. So they're brought on board the ship to learn on the job, so to speak. So they spend a summer on board the ship. So during the post-war years from 1946 to 1947, the North Carolina participated in these MIDI cruises. The ship was finally decommissioned on June 27, 1947 in New York and placed into the reserve fleet. She remained on the Navy's inventory until stricken from the Naval Register on June 1, 1960, and was slated to be scrapped. And on the bottom right, you can see the North Carolina in the Ghost Fleet in Bayonne. Now, James Craig Jr. and Hugh Morton had the idea to raise funds and to save the ship and make it a World War II memorial. They created the North Carolina Navy, where they had each of the state's 100 counties would have an admiral that would be in charge of raising funds. Kids were, at this time, were told to bring a dime, and the kids' dimes got them free admission to the battleship. So eventually they raised $330,000, and they accepted the ship from the Navy and prepared a suitable berth for her on Eagle Island, which is right across from downtown Wilmington. For those that know their Civil War history, this is also the site of the Berry Shipyard, the Confederate Naval Shipyard where the CSS North Carolina and CSS Raleigh were built during this Confederate Navy period. In September of 1961, the ship was saved from being scrapped in Bayonne and was brought to be placed in the Cape Fear River in downtown Wilmington. On the bottom left, you can see the North Carolina being towed into the Cape Fear River. And for those that are from the Wilmington area, they always talk about the floating restaurant, the Ark, that was at the foot of Market Street. Well, the North Carolina smashed it with its stern when they were moving it in. So the tugboats got it a little bit too tight, and they smashed in the Ark right on the side. So that was the last time that became a floating restaurant. But the ship actually was put into place, and it took about a year or so to get it ready for visitors. Now, in 1962, when the ship opened as a memorial, the USS North Carolina Battleship Association was formed. This is an organization of the battleship's crew and their families. The association began in June of 1962 and has continued ever since. As long as there are survivors of the World War II or the MIDI cruises, the Battleship Association will continue. Sadly, over the years, we've lost many of the original crew members. When I worked on board the battleship in the 90s and early 2000s, they were usually in their 60s and had some great sea stories. So every year that passed, it was like losing a grandfather every year. So for many years, Whitey's Restaurant on Market Street was their hangout. And it was Whitey's Restaurant and Motor Inn. I haven't been to Wilmington in a while, don't know if it's still there. But this was the home base for the crew. So they would eat in the restaurant, and then they had rooms on the back, like a little motor inn. And they would usually have three things that they brought along with them. They would bring their USS North Carolina hat, a bottle of liquor, and some great stories. And so they would stay up into the night with their crew members and talking about their life on board the ship. Their stories from a war long ago serve as a proud testament to the proud history of the USS North Carolina and the state it's named for. As you can see on the left, this is a picture of the crew. Of the front row is some of the Battleship Association sailors, and on the back are members of the Living History crew, which dress in World War II uniforms to recreate life on board the ship. In the picture in the center, that's Paul. Last you saw, he had his hand on a car that didn't belong to him. But that's Paul when I worked on board the ship, and on Bob Palomares on the right, who you heard from earlier in the speech. So the North Carolina, as I said, is also the state's World War II memorial. And as such, it honors all of the men and women that served and died from North Carolina during World War II. And it's a proud testament to it. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. If you have any questions, if you'll raise your hand and I'll come to you. And I just want to say my grandfather was on the Wasp when it was sunk, and he spent some time in the water. But so thought it was interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Well, this is a simple question, but when you were talking about the dimensions of the ship, you mentioned the beam. Is that across or up?
I'm sorry, I was using a Navy term. Yeah, it's the width of the ship. So the width of the ship is 108 feet, so it can get through the Panama Canal. So.
Hold on.
Thank you. I read that when the German battleship Bismarck sank the British Hood, just an incredible fluke of bad luck, but a shell from the Bismarck penetrated several decks on the hood and then exploded in the powder magazine. Would such a streak of bad luck be possible on a ship like North Carolina?
Well, as opposed to the Hood, which was an old war, it was an older ship. The armor on board some of those ships were not as good as the armor that was later developed. The North Carolina, their armor also was made for aircraft as well. The ships that were built, prior to the 1920s, they weren't built to accept bombs from above. So they would go right through the ship, as what happened with the Arizona. The North Carolina was built with reinforced steel decks. And does anybody know why teak is used on the deck of a Navy ship at that time? Because when hit, teak won't splinter. So it'll just go right through it. So that's why teak is used on board ships. But yes, I wouldn't say that couldn't happen on board North Carolina, but that would have to be a really, really lucky shot to hit it just right. But the way the North Carolina was designed, I don't think it would probably be possible like what happened to the Hood, unfortunately. But also the Bismarck had some big guns as well. So.
One of your slides had a word in all caps. It's something like triptychs or something.
I'm sorry,
One of your slides had a word in all capital letters. Triptychs, something like that. I wondered what that was.
It was an acronym. Was it an acronym?
oh, Truk. Truk?
No, it was TRIPT. Yes.
Oh, the Tirpitz?
What was that?
Okay, that's a German battleship, what they called a pocket battleship. So pocket battleships were a little bit smaller, but the Tirpitz was a real threat to the British because it was fast. It was one of the first of the fast battleships. And North Carolina was kept in the Atlantic for so long because eventually they thought they would have to take on some of these German battleships. They weren't really expecting war with Japan. They were all expecting the war with Germany. And some of the old-timers think that the battleship was really built to take on the Bismarck and take on the German battleships. Later do we know that part of that may be true, but the Japanese would be the main adversary for North Carolina.
That was easy.
I've been on a few battleships, and no ship I've ever been on has the access that the North Carolina has as far as going through the entire ship, going through the turrets all the way down, like 4 levels. How did that come about when it was turned into a memorial and open to the public that you guys created such incredible access to it?
Well, thank you, and that's a real compliment because that's exactly what we wanted to do. Kim Sincox, who is still the curator on board the Battleship North Carolina, did an excellent job with not only the exhibits but also designing tour routes along with the captains of the ship over the years. When the ship was first brought there, it was pretty much a main deck, 2 decks down. You can see some of the older tour routes because they still have sometimes the older signs on them, or they had the gratings in front of them. When I came on board the battleship in 95, 96, one of the things we wanted to do was open up more of the ship. So to tell you a little bit about that, of how important the crew members are. So I wanted to restore the executive officer's office, which is right on the main ship, right on the main deck. This is where the men went to get their Liberty cards. I mean, it was a busy place. It was used as storage when I came on board. I wanted to restore it. Problem is, I didn't know what it looked like. So I had the commissioning photos in 1941, But those do not tell the story. Because in 1941, if you'd have gone aboard the North Carolina, it was beautiful. Red linoleum, polished to a high sheen, painted perfectly, just beautiful. Well, all of that after Pearl Harbor was chucked overboard. So what they had was the ship was, they had the steel deck like they do now, because all that linoleum was ripped up, and the paint was taken off, and then they put on this anti-flammable paint, which looked like chalk. And so that's what the inside of the ship looked like during the war years. So I didn't know what it looked like. So I asked Gordon Knapp. I met Gordon. He came on board during the Midi cruises in 1946. And I said, Gordon, he told me he was in the executive officer's office. And I said, I want to talk to you. And I said, do you remember what the inside of this place looked like? And he said, boy, do I. He said, you know what, Jeff? I think I have some photographs that I took of the inside of the XO's office. And I'm like, how did you do that? That was illegal. He said, well, the XO allowed me to take photos. So I said, bring those. And so he brought in a stack of photographs this big of interior parts of the ship that we did not know what they looked like prior to that. One of them was every wall of the executive officer's office. And so all of the original furniture, when the ship was brought in as a tour, were thrown down in what we called Portsmouth, which is a berthing area on the bottom, which is filled with furniture that we stole off ghost ships and everything else for the ship. So I wondered if the distinguished, these Liberty Card racks were still down there. And so I go rooting through there, and I'm kind of short, so one of the maintenance guys would hold me by the legs, and I'm reaching down there trying to find it. And lo and behold, I found all of the original furniture that went into the executive officer's office, including the wooden Liberty box, where they would put their Liberty cards in. And as a result of those, I was able to restore the entire compartment from those photos. And one piece, when I moved a filing cabinet that had not been moved since 1947, guess what was underneath it? A piece of linoleum about this big. Probably the only linoleum that was still left on board that ship. They didn't want to move the filing cabinet. Sailors don't change. So they didn't want to move that filing cabinet, so they ripped it up all the way around it. But that's the only piece of linoleum that I found on board the ship. So thank you for that. It's a lot of work, and the crew were great and helped with that. And over the years, since I've left, they've opened up even more of the ship. But we opened up a whole lot while we were down there. Main battery plot, which had not been on the tour before, all that was open in the late 90s.
Why'd they take the linoleum up?
It's flammable, extremely flammable.
But did they not know that when they put it in?
Oh yeah, but I mean, it's pretty.
Oh.
During peacetime, I mean, they don't worry about that. But the ships at Pearl Harbor went up like Roman candles because of the paint and the linoleum on the decks. As a result of that, the U.S. Navy ordered them stripped of every U.S. Navy ship. The linoleum taken up and the paint removed and the flash paint put on.
I understand that the Navy left a whole bunch of records on the ship. They basically took off what they wanted but left everything else there. Is that true? Did it take a long time for the records to be gone through?
Well, partly true. When I was on board the ship, I would routinely go below and start picking up a lot of those things to accession them and bring them into our collection and actually restore them or keep them preserved. One of the storerooms I went down below in, I walked in and it looked like they had just walked out in 1947. There was a calendar that was on the date, of the date of the decommissioning. There was a pack of chewing gum and a pack of Lucky Strikes in the drawer. There was a pad and pencil, and one of them said goodbye on it. And so it looked like they had just walked out. A lot of down below off the tour route, there were a lot of paperwork because they basically just left it. If the Navy didn't want it, they left it because the ship was in mothballs. Some of the interesting things I found while I was working on a berthing area is I went into the overhead and found a bottle of liquor. It was empty. Also a baseball that was found in one of the overheads. So in a way, yes, but nothing really official records because all of those would have been taken off, but more the mementos of the crew, which I find to be much more valuable as a historian. But the below decks at that time, walking into them was like walking into a time capsule.
Anybody else? Dr. Campbell, did you have a question? I had one question. Hold on, I'm coming for you.
Gotta be loud.
How many rounds of
That I don't know. You know, it varied so many times, hundreds and hundreds of rounds. The entire barbettes, all 3 barbettes, and if you're on tour today, you'll be able to see them, how they ring around the bottom. That's where all the projectiles would be stored, you know, above the powder room. Oh, no, hundreds. Yeah, not thousands. These things weighed as much as a Volkswagen Beetle. And they could fire up to 23 miles with pinpoint accuracy. So they were a technological marvel for the day, using those modern IBM computers that were about the size of this. And they could fire those with pinpoint accuracy. But the armor-piercing shells and the high-explosive shells weighed as much as a Volkswagen Beetle. So I would say hundreds, but definitely not thousands.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you coming tonight.
Thank you very much.
We hope you'll come back next week and hear about the whirligigs from 2 of our speakers, same time, same place.